Hey Twitch, welcome back to the stream. My name is Spencer Krum. I'm a developer advocate. I'm joined here by Gordon. Do you want to introduce yourself, Gordon?
Yep, I'm Gordon Haff, technology evangelist at Red Hat.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. Have you ever been on Twitch before?
I have not.
Well, it's basically just live streaming. I think we're actually broadcasting for the first time through a intermediary service that will let us do YouTube and Twitch at the same time. But the show lives on Twitch, so we more or less talk to Twitch. This here is the Twitch chat, and Gordon's an open source expert. So if you have questions on, we'll talk about your pedigree in a second. But if you have questions about open source and some of the technologies we're talking about, throw the questions in the chat. We're happy to help answer those. We do have a couple things for you all to do. We have a Coursera link below, and then Call for Code 2019 was just announced. Be sure to check that out. It's a large event that we want you to participate in. So with that underway, Gordon, why don't you take us through the bit?
Yeah, well, I've been doing open source for a while, wrote a book on it last year.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Take a year or two before I forget all the pain, and I'll be ready to do it. I'll be ready to subject myself to it again. But, I'm at Red Hat. We talk a lot about open source with people. And one of the things that strikes me is here we are in 2019, and a lot of people still don't get it, or they think it's something that isn't. I mean, like recently, there were some announcements last year where it was basically, we think open source is a buzzword. We'll make up a license that is not actually an open source license.
There were a couple of companies, MongoDB among them, Redis among them, that broke from tradition. The word, you might say this in 10 seconds, but the word open source is actually generally held by an organization called the Open Source Initiative, and they have a team, an army of lawyers that decide what is and is not open source. Some companies, mentioned a second ago, wrote their own licenses, and a very small section of the world, which is those of us who are nerds about open source licenses, just exploded in a frenzy of and that was very fun.
Yeah. Well, I do.
And it's ongoing.
Yeah, and I do a lot of writing, and I belong to a group called Word Nerds at Red Hat that we do all the style guide stuff and everything. And words actually matter sometimes. You can't just make up something up or say something is not and have it be real.
Yeah, it is not a choice.
Yeah. The flip side of that, and I'm going to kind of more get into this in a few slides, but open source is also not just a template. It's not just one thing. It has certain core principles that the OSI, for example, has spelled out. But as you go through business models, as you go through community models, one of the things you see is circumstances differ. So neither I nor anyone else can say, here, you follow this checklist and you've got open source.
Right. It is not, you can't be super prescriptive about it.
Yeah. And one example of that is licenses. I think particularly historically, we got very wrapped up in sort of license ideology almost. And one of the things that we've seen in the last few years is that that's receded in importance. It's still important that, because open source is defined at some level by the licenses, but getting into a lot of the, this license is better than that license, other things matter a lot more.
Other community, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, absolutely.
There's a long list of things. The beauty of it is, you've really done important work when people stop knowing how much you helped, right? So we have a debt of gratitude to the people who trailblazed in the 90s and the early 2000s to get a handful of licenses. There was a period of time they called vanity licensing.
Yeah.
That is over. There's 5 or 6 really common licenses, and they're well understood by the legal teams at all the biggest technology firms, IBM among them, Red Hat among them. And so it has never been safer or easier to use open source, to consume open source, to provide open source as a service, to wrap up open source in your products. And then promptly everyone forgot how hard it was to get there, and we're right back on the cycle.
Yeah. Well, and there are some core principles embedded in OSI approved licenses. For example, you can't say this is open source, but not for military use, or it's open source but not for commercial use.
Yes.
And we forget that those are not, that's not an obvious place to get to, and yet is one of the reasons open source has been so successful.
Exactly.
I feel very strongly about this one. So
Me too, buddy.
open source. So I think there is this idea of, me as a vendor takes my code, throws it out onto GitHub or wherever, doesn't allow outside committers to the code base, or makes it very difficult
Onerous,
to do.
with some kind of a contributor license
Right.
agreement.
Yeah, I mean, contributor license agreements sometimes make sense, but they can also be onerous. And yes, technically it is open source. It complies with an OSI license. It's also, in 95% of the cases, utterly and completely useless, because there's no good governance model, there's no vibrant community around it, there are none of the other things that actually make open source a lot more interesting than having an open source license.
I 100% agree. One of the lines I learned in university was, you can make open source software and leave it in your basement, but it's not the same.
Yeah. I mean, many years ago, I had a shareware program, DOS, that I had kind of stopped development on, and people were going, oh, you ought to open source it. And finally I said, fine, release there the GPL. Nobody ever did a darn thing.
No, yeah.
Another, I think, topical topic is open source is not just about taking.
Right.
And you may think I'm saying this because, it's not because of fairness reasons, or because people have a moral imperative to contribute back to code. And I'd argue there is a little bit of that, but the much more important reason is you don't want to, for instance, be stuck with maintaining your proprietary fork of open source code. It's not good open source development practice just to take and not give back.
Yeah, if you, it's a very simple algorithm, right? It's like, oh, by not building this in-house, we've saved X dollars, and then we'll just pull it off of open source, and then, okay, your project is going well, and then the maintaining of this thing that you didn't choose and you didn't understand because you didn't invest when it was an open source project and keep the community going falls squarely on your shoulders, and it's actually more work than just any of the other options. So it happens for sure.
One thing that we still hear debates about that I will kind of tackle both sides of is the security of open source debate. And the open source is insecure, I would argue, stems from flawed analogies to the physical world. You as a bank, might trust your security team. You might think that you set up all your alarm systems and so forth. That doesn't mean you actually publish your alarm blueprints on the web, because even if security by obscurity doesn't work, it isn't a panacea. In the physical world, there is benefit to it, in addition to other security practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in this one, you're talking about the argument that the problem with open source code is that it's not safe to run because the source code is out there and people are finding vulnerabilities that they're not disclosing.
Right. And the thing is, most security attacks are not based by a hacker somewhere making a very careful study of source code and finding a problem. It's by running scripts against exposed, services out on the internet, where in many cases those exposed services in the internet have in fact had whatever security vulnerability it was fixed 2 years ago, and a patch hasn't been applied to it, even though the patch is available.
Well, look, we argued hard in that meeting for that downtime, and they just wouldn't give it to us, for sure.
Yeah, and by the same token, I'm not going to flip it and say open source is inherently secure. And this is the many eyeballs make bugs shallow. But one of the things that we've seen in recent years, some cases where the critical infrastructure software was being maintained by one or two people and had gotten $30,000 in donations over the last 3 years to do this. And that there's not a lot of eyeballs then, and there's not a lot of resources. And there has been some work in this area, so like the Core Infrastructure Initiative,
Is that
the
on the Linux Foundation?
Linux
Yeah.
Foundation, trying to identify these. This little project that everyone depends on.
Yeah, I'll throw out some proper
Yeah.
nouns here. So I think OpenSSL is a common one,
Yeah.
and the NTP daemons, I think,
Right,
also.
yes.
This is stuff, like I said, you solve the problem well when people stop thinking about it. Everyone uses NTP. Nobody paid $1 for NTP. It was maintained by somebody in their basement who had no
Yeah.
job or something like
Yeah.
that. It was a sad state of affairs. So yes, we're pleased with the Linux Foundation stepping up and trying to formalize, as the Linux Foundation does, that kind of stuff around what is it, the Core Infrastructure Initiative?
Core Infrastructure Initiative.
Yeah, and then of course I'll just also say thank you to Red Hat and OpenSUSE and your
And
Canonical
IBM.
as well
Yeah.
for working on. Because Red Hat absolutely, in particular, pays for things that no one else is fixing. Random GNOME bugs and stuff like that. So we do appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'd also say open source is not a business model. And I'm maybe being a little bit pedantic here because obviously open source plays into business models. I mean, if someone can download the code for free, you have certain business model approaches that are, they're going to be constrained.
They follow naturally, right? Yeah.
Right. However, it's sort of the idea that open source is you just charge for support, and that's a business model. Well, it's not a business model. If you are selling software that is developed in whole or in part using an open source development model, you still need a business model just like any proprietary software company would, in terms of who are you targeting, what is your value proposition, all those boring things that MBAs and the like have to come up with.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if we had more time to talk about it, I would almost love to break down some of the specific business models around open source we're seeing. Yeah. And then, we talked a second ago about the little bit of kerfuffle in the license land. Is, part of that is driven by a business model married to an open source project, and then like the changing nature of cloud and how it's affecting how software is bought and sold.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to make light of the challenges here with building successful business models around open source, although building successful business models, period,
It's difficult work.
It's difficult to begin with. And certainly one of the things that we're seeing are with cloud services, with open core and things like that going on, there are attempts to get around the traditional challenges with having a business model based around open source that nobody's really, maybe with the exception of Red Hat, have really come up with the magic bullet to solving.
And again, Red Hat isn't a magic bullet. It is a lot of work and a constant iteration and a drive to constantly reinvent yourself and stuff like that.
Yeah, and finally, we've been talking code here, and coming from an open source software company, that's what I do a lot of the focus on. But I think particularly with the very large data sets that are at the heart of AI, machine learning, for example, with open education initiatives, with some open hardware, which is a harder problem, arguably, in some ways, but there's still some interesting things going on. I mean, IBM is actually very, very early with around power, for example, in that area. And it's challenging because the capital costs associated with building hardware, particularly semiconductor and the like, makes that hard. But I think particularly the data is something that we shouldn't look at code and think we've solved things, because data is going to be very important, and in many cases you can have fully open source code, algorithms, etc. in the AI machine learning space, but if your data and your training models and so forth are closed, arguably the code doesn't matter very much. So, kind of maybe in closing, I mean, we'd like to talk a few things about what open source actually is from my perspective. The first is, I think coming from the customer standpoint, what open source has really done is provide strategic flexibility for customers. And this is the whole hybrid cloud idea. You're not locked into a specific cloud provider. You're not locked into a specific software vendor. And so I think from a customer standpoint, maybe open source get in the door in the first place because it was cheaper than Solaris or whatever, but really over time.
Our longtime viewers will know that I'm a Solaris fanboy. I take any opportunity to be like, Sun had it figured out, okay?
Yeah. Well, both Sun and IBM are
Containers in 2005, right? Can you imagine?
But yeah, I mean, the idea of you do get this flexibility through open source, and customers, I've moved on by and large from the low price to, among other things, the strategic flexibility.
Absolutely. And I think there's also a component of that, which is staffing, right?
Yeah.
If you're vendored into a particular application or part of your infrastructure, it always comes up in not the application layer, but like the layer right below that.
Right.
Either the app layer, either the like the deployment layer or the database. Databases are very big in open source and stuff like that. But like, to pick on I'm not going to pick on a specific database company, but like, let's say that there's a big one that we all hate. Just hypothetically, there's a big one that we all hate. But the thing is, if you drive into that, if you make your whole business operation around that database, then you're locked into the staffing components of keeping people who know it. And then you're just kind of at the mercy of the wind, because either, some vendor, talking not about databases now, some vendors do a great job of making sure that there's training and there's certifications and all this stuff, and a really healthy pool of acknowledged, capable talent, so that companies can just, grab people and get them in and get them working on it, and then, send them away and then get them in, and, but some vendors are terrible at it, and you get these job requests on LinkedIn or other companies, other web pages that are like, I need an expert in this bizarre thing only 4 people have ever bought, and how do you ever get somebody who's really solid who can also maintain that piece of software?
And how are you going to get a new college hire who to kind of devote the next few years of their lives to learning this obscure thing that they know there might be 1 or 2 employers who are willing to hire them?
So having there's a bunch of staffing. You look at the open source model, like we bring in an open source database, if you really need to, you can hire the people who write the database. If it is that core to your business, you can fully integrate with the community. There's a ton of people working on it because it's free and open source and popular. People are always installing it in other infrastructures. There's people to learn from. It's real exciting. It's good stuff, guys.
Yeah. It's sharing, and I mean this not really in the kind of the peace, love, hippies, Linux kind of sense of, we'll all share with each other and, be happy. But what I am, though, is that you can share, there can be almost a quid pro quo with your co-opetition in whatever industry is, because you can I mean, a great example was around basically a messaging protocol developed in the financial services industry, AMQP, and basically all these big financial institutions who most certainly compete with each other, but they didn't all compete on a message bus.
That's not your differentiator.
A message bus standard is not their differentiator. It's their proprietary training algorithms or what have you. So I think by the ability to share things that are not critical differentiators for your specific business, there's actually a huge business advantage to doing that.
Yeah, I think it's good. Yeah, I agree.
That really brings us to it. Ultimately, in many ways, open source software is characterized by it being a development model. I mean, we are sort of our sort of shorthand at Red Hat is we're an enterprise software company built on an open source development model. And that is where kind of all the community and the cooperation and the sharing and the ability for companies to work together really comes out. One of the observations I like to make is people sometimes look at that and go, yeah, but companies have always partnered on stuff, so how is it any different? So I like to point them to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation list of projects, which is, I don't know if anybody has looked at that, but look at the CNCF landscape and have your magnifying glass handy. They actually have a much easier to sort of access them one by one now, but there's a lot of stuff there. There are not, even IBM doesn't have enough lawyers to write the agreements for the number of cooperation that would be needed in a formal sense. Instead, engineers can start playing around with stuff and working in things, and in many cases decide, nah, this isn't good for us, but this over here is. So it just removes an incredible amount of friction.
Yeah, I think that, and again, it goes back to the safety, right? Because it's established and your bigger players in your tech scene are comfortable with open source development. In most cases, there's some edge cases which we're not going to get into, but the thing is that there's a standard way, and Linux Foundation is the pioneer that helps us, Linux, Apache, some of the other open source foundations, right? Makes it possible for, IBM. It makes it possible for an IBM and a Google and whoever to just like, we're all going to write some software together. We're going to get kind of agreement on what the strategy is. And then, you go back inside the company and you say like, all right, this is what we're working on in open source. What is this going to turn into our products? Like, what's our plan here? How does it integrate? It's really, and like that's been my career since I joined the workforce here. So it's very successful, and I think you're right to call it out.
Yeah, and maybe at an even higher level, ultimately, it's about enabling companies to collaborate. And there's a term. It was actually originally coined by Ray Norda at Novell, which was co-opetition. Mm-hmm. And the story I like to tell is way back in the days when I was a product manager, and we made computers out of stone knives and bear skins and things like that. But
you had to hunt down your silicon yourself.
we had the mini computer companies. You made disk drives, you made networking cards, you made your own chips, etc. But we were moving over to PCI bus-based systems, and we bought a networking card from Digital Equipment. And I got a call. I think it was an email, and I really wish I kept this email because it's sort of such a snapshot in time, which was, we're out there competing with DEC, Digital Equipment, on a daily basis, and you, not very nice people in marketing, go and stab us in the back by buying a product from our competitor. And you listen to that story today and you go, really? I mean, who operates like that? But that was the norm back then. So I think this idea that pretty much everywhere, companies are going to be, they're companies and they're competitors, so they're going to be competing with each other. But no one can do everything themselves in this day and age, and they need to be able to embrace this co-opetition and work with other companies, share with other companies where it makes sense for them to do so.
Right. It's awesome, when you're really cooking with gas in open source and you work at a company, you spend half as a developer, you spend half your time talking to people who work at the same company you do, and you spend the other half talking to all your competitors, and you're just like, yeah, I guess this is what we're doing. Let's build this thing.
Yeah, so I think that's, in a nutshell, how I view open source.
Thanks for sharing your vision with us. Thanks for coming on the show. A couple just random questions. What's your favorite open source project?
Oh, what is my favorite? I would have to say OpenShift, Kubernetes. And I think one of the reasons that's interesting is because we're seeing how Kubernetes, and also just cloud native generally, how it's pulling all of these projects, many of which were scratching some individual companies, monitoring or distributed tracing or whatever needs, and is really pulling that stuff together and making it consumable, whereas assembling your own stuff out of all these community projects on your own, is great to experiment with, but probably not what you want to do as an enterprise company.
Absolutely, and I would throw some serious love at the Kubernetes project. They've done a great job of specifically saying, like, these are the APIs that we're going to support, and we're not going to overbuild inside the Kubernetes core.
Right.
And that creates a wonderful playground for companies and individual open source open source projects to be started that like plug into the Kubernetes API and make the whole system do something new, right? And then those companies, Sysdig is one of them that they write their open source project, Sysdig Falco, and then they get it sort of, I think they're in one of the tiers of CNCF adoption, right? The sandbox or something like that. So that's really exciting. So I'll definitely call that out as well. So we're going to take a break. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Looking forward to working with you more in the future. We have a Coursera link below. Call for Code is still going on. We'll be back in just like a hot minute with Ishu Verma from Red Hat, who's going to be talking about IoT or Internet of Things. So stay with us.
Great. Thank you.